Welcome to the Miami Jewish Film Festival, the world's largest festival of its kind. We want to thank our members, sponsors, partners, and all of our film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for Advancement of Jewish Education, SAGE Miami, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all the years. My name is Carly Orshan, and I'm the director of the Teen Department in March of Living for SAGE Miami. And I'm excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with filmmaker Maxim Pozdorovkin from the movie The Conspiracy, which is premiering at the festival this year and which you have all already seen. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. We are excited to be with you, Maxim, and to learn about your journey to filmmaking and where you lived, where you are living now, how filmmaking has been part of your life, and how you came to this process, this particular film at this point in time, and how that experience was for you.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and to the virtual audience of the future, thank you for watching the film, and I hope it moved you. I was born in the Soviet Union. I was born in Moscow, and then moved to the U.S. When I was like 10 or 11 years old. And I was always kind of, a film nerd, culture vulture, and interested in culture. And I did not study film in college, but then when I went to grad school, I did a PhD about the history of media technology. And while there was ample resources to sort of start making a film. And I was, a lot of the stuff that I was writing about, so a lot of early cinema, early propaganda, I started kind of wanting to experiment and to try to make films like that, in a sense, a sort of ambitious films about big subjects, etc. And so I made a film while still finishing my PhD. I made a film called Capital, which was sort of about this utopian capital city in Kazakhstan. And it was sort of meant to be a city symphony film, like a lot of the early films. And then I finished the PhD, but I got very lucky that I had made several films that were quite successful. I made a film about the Russian art collective Pussy Riot. Then I made a bunch of other a film about the arms dealer Victor Boot, and continued working. And again, I've always been interested in kind of being intellectually rigorous about these kinds of larger subjects. So I made another film called The Truth About Killer Robots for HBO, about automation and sort of the threat of it and the emotional side. And a lot of times I felt like I was making films about a subject that journalists were simultaneously also covering. And so as a filmmaker, there's a kind of particular challenge of both going deeper and making sure that you get it right. So, for example, when we were making the Pussy Riot film, the band members were, the art collective members were still in jail. And let's say the full awfulness of Putin was not, fully exposed in the way that it was now. And so you sort of make certain interpretive bets on the future, and hopefully you get it right. Now, with this film, there was a sense that that no matter when it came out, it would sort of be, it's a subject that's tragically evergreen, if I can call a phrase. And it came to me through two executive producers on the film who were involved in producing a history of anti-Semitism that was just sort of like a textbook. And they were interested in making a movie, but the book had nothing cinematic about it. It was just sort of a listing. And so they came to me, and I was fascinated almost entirely by the fact of how utterly difficult the project seemed. And, and at the same and it seemed difficult both because I understood that to do it justice, you had to cover a massive amount of time to really show its kind of permutation and recurrence through time of anti-Semitism. And at the same time, you realize that as a documentary maker, your usual arsenal, the tools that you have at your disposal, so archive, photographs, all these things are virtually non-existent for once you get to the roots and the origins of anti-Semitism and of conspiracy. So for me, that was the first kind of big challenge that formally you would have to be so inventive, because I understood that having just, let's say, elderly historians, God bless them, but just kind of narrating the history, that was just a no-go. I wouldn't watch that film, even though I'm sort of interested in the subject. And then as I started working on it, I had this, there was also this sort of challenge of coming up with a definition that would serve of a subject event that would serve a film, and you could really build a film around. And that involved also doing a tremendous amount of research. And from the beginning, what started to crystallize in my head, because I didn't really have a ready set book that I was just adapting. I was reading a lot. I was reading a lot of memoirs, because I realized that what would make this a documentary were sort of the primary sources, and being really rooted in the memoirs and the letters of these three families. But the broader picture, what I sensed was that anti-Semitism is this kind of conspiracy theory in a kind of narrative told about the Jews. And at the same time, this was crystallizing in my head, and it's a conspiracy theory that specifically really emerges out of European nationalism in the 19th century. There's certain historians that will, and I tend to favor this approach, that really split kind of Christian anti-Judaism, even though of course it's a continuum, but Christian anti-Judaism as it exists sort of through the Middle Ages and even before, and what starts to happen in the 19th century, which is this right-wing narrative about Jews that emerges and is essentially fueled by nationalism and European nationalism as it emerges in the 19th century. So, and at the same time, as I was thinking through this, QAnon and all these things were so big, and you would often hear people say that all conspiracy theories are kind of anti-Semitic. And to me, it seemed a bit of a strange statement, but I was curious by it. And what I really realized, and to me this was kind of a big insight, is that the history of actually I'll start somewhere else. That if you take all conspiracy theories, whether it's chemtrails, the moon landing was fake, flat earthers, any of them, they all share this one element, and it's this notion of a group that's working behind the scenes, hiding the truth, creating an alternative reality that they sell to the rubes. And to me, I was like, so where does this idea came from? So I tracked it down, and what's fascinating is that it originates as this sort of right-wing history of the French Revolution written by this Jesuit priest, Augustin Barruel, who you saw in the film. And initially, this narrative has nothing to do with Jews, does not really mention them. But then he receives a letter at the end of his life from an Italian military captain that still has yet to be identified whether he was a real person or not, but copies of the letter exist, saying that, oh, you've done this wonderful thing, you've uncovered, this is the greatest work of the century, but you forgot one group, and that it's the Jews that are behind all of this, and that they're really the puppet masters of this centuries-long ludicrous conspiracy to begin with. And this idea slowly kind of snowballs and evolves, reappearing in very, very random places. I like to say that this is kind of a film about kind of a story moving from the fringe to the mainstream. And initially it was sort of a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy, and it was a combination of Jews and Freemasons. And then the Freemasons fell away, and it became Jewish rabbis at a cemetery in Prague, but in a fictional version. But then this fictional version gets reprinted as a historical pamphlet, as if it was true. And then it eventually gets to the Protocols of Elders of Zion and, and Nazism, basically. So for me, it was tracing that, but then I realized I couldn't just make it, and realizing that a lot of, even though the topic of anti-Semitism has been covered sort of extensively, a lot of even the very basic facts are kind of wrong. Like if you look them up in Wikipedia, they're wrong. So for example, if you take the Protocols of Elders of Zion, you know, and you look at Wikipedia, it will still say that it was written by the Russian secret police around the Dreyfus affair in France. Complete nonsense. So when we know this from very obvious things like that the protocols reference the Boxer Rebellion, which was like 5-6 years later. And we also know from a wonderful book by Steven Zipperstein that it's been pretty definitively proven in academic circles that the protocols initially were kind of compiled, written by the same guy that started the Chisinau pogrom, you know. And so for me, what emerged is this idea of taking three families that were thrust into this narrative, three families that could not be more opposite, could not be greater ideological enemies, and then trace, so who share nothing other than being Jewish, and all of them were made scapegoats and thrust into this kind of conspiracy narrative that essentially then went from the fringe to the mainstream. So that was a very long, rambling answer to my biography up to making this film.
It's wonderful. There's so many things that I want to follow up on. And I was taking some notes so that I can try to do so. But there's a few things I'll go back to, but the first thing that kind of really stands out, you know, after thinking about this inception and how you want to kind of build this narrative, you know, how did you choose this medium? Like, it's a unique framework. You have narration, you have, you know, first person narration, you know, in terms of the stories, using, as you mentioned, the documentary primary sources, and then this like art animation, right? This art in a very unique way of doing art. And how did you decide on those elements? And is that part of framing for the audience? Like, who is the ultimate audience for this idea?
You know, the audience are people that are, it's a very, very, let's start off by being honest that we're living in an incredibly anti-intellectual time in which knowledge of history is virtually dead, that people bring very, very little background knowledge. And I'm not trying to be a snob about this, it's just sort of the truth. So when you're dealing with a subject like this and a story that covers several hundred years, there's a lot of heavy lifting that just needs to be done in terms of exposition. And so as much as I don't usually like having any kind of narration, here was absolutely necessary to weave it together and to kind of put it together. So, you know, earlier I mentioned that from the beginning, given the lack of visual material that exists about, you know, for example, with someone like Max Warburg's, there's 2 photos, and there's a little bit more than 2 photos, but there's a dozen photos and 2 tiny clips of him at Versailles, and nothing else. You know, with Dreyfus, there's some photographs. With Madeline Dreyfus, there's 2 tiny little passport-sized photographs. So realizing that limitation and realizing that I did not want to just have it be sort of narrated from the present day by historians sort of retelling the past. And the real reason for that is both kind of that it's boring, but at the same time, reading these memoirs and reading Trotsky's memoir, reading the letters of Dreyfus to his wife, what's so fascinating is how insightful they are about their own predicament, how they understand and express these things. You know, if you look at even something like Trotsky's indictment of Hitler, he was one of the earliest people on record and to really kind of nail it so perfectly and kind of see the evil that was ahead. So to me, that was a way of kind of brushing the archive dust off them and recreating them as real people that had real emotions, that, you know, that lived through this pain and kind of persevered. And, you know, and there's such, and so that was the decision that the primary source did. And then I wanted to try animation, and as sort of COVID hit and we were starting to make this film, I initially kind of considered having more interviews, but that idea fell away. And as I was writing the script and creating it, we just decided to go for it. And with animation, I really hate cutesy, like sheen, glossy animation. And when it comes to subjects like the Holocaust or anything else, to me, it just feels like it's in bad taste. And I respect that there's beautiful films made like that, but it's just sort of, so I really like the sort of palimpsest like um bleeding colors, almost the feeling of hand-drawn animation. And there's a wonderful Soviet tradition of that. So from the beginning, and I also wanted animation that was somewhere between 2D and 3D. We called it like 2.5D. So the little pieces of archive that do exist, the furniture, the portraits, can kind of exist within the world of the archive. So that's why we came up with this style. And it was a kind of a pretty original pipeline as far as I understand, because we use some AI to, we would basically create 3D models of the characters, have record the actors separately, then essentially have body actors that would act it out. And so once we have all that, we would give it to a group of illustrators who would basically be working and hand drawing, not every single frame, but maybe every 4 or 5 frames. It depends a little bit on how much motion there is in the shot. And then a program essentially stitches that together to create that effect. So, but the idea was that how to bring these people alive and to make, to be able to do a narrative that covers such vast distances and to still have it work. And again, and then also dealing with people about whom so little is known. And especially in case, not in the Dreyfus, but in case of like the conspiracy theorists who are spreading a lot of this stuff that, about some of them, there's not even a book written.
Mhm. No, and I think you do that well, especially in terms of the 3 main families. I mean, you understand a little bit more of the emotions and the experiences of them in particular. And I think that's something that, people are, when history is being told, it's that these are the facts, and you don't necessarily see the nuance underneath, and the varying layers of these individual people's like experiences. And I think that, in recognizing that the history and evolution of anti-Semitism is so expansive, coming in from this particular corner is really quite fascinating. And I think, in the work that I do with teenagers, I'm looking forward to showing this to them. I'm curious if you've had younger audiences, you've heard of them experiencing this, if you've heard about what takeaways they might be learning from this to kind of give history a new way of looking at history. Because we know that it's hard to teach about these subjects and about this evolution of anti-Semitism. And I'm curious what your experience has been after showing this film.
I mean, you in your question, you've basically said what I would say, which is that it's difficult. You have to make it more accessible. You have to make it alive. And I've been thrilled that when kids watch it, they can watch it. They dig. Like, again, let's be real. 16-year-olds are not going to watch a PBS documentary about the Holocaust and sort of, so I think that, yeah, they're able to be swayed by the music, by the acting, by the animation, and follow it. And yes, it is dense. Yes, it is all these things, but at least they can immerse themselves in the culture. So from the very beginning, there's actually just a Jerusalem Post blurb about the film that came out that mentioned this, about it being good for children. I mean, from the beginning, that was the idea. And then at the same time, it's also, even something as famous as the Dreyfus Affair, most adults kind of have like a vague cloud sense of, oh yeah, something in France, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that even these stories that maybe to a certain generation were much more well known. It's just not the case anymore, for a lot of people. And I think that, and I feel like that it's interesting that there are animated documentaries, obviously, The Tower, Waltz with Bashir, there's all these things, but um, I've never seen one that's used specifically to grapple with history writ large, with this sort of kind of panoramic aspect of history. And that's what I think I was trying to do, both in the writing of the film and, and the methodology.
Yeah. I think, something that you said earlier, which is coming back to me now, is that yes, you're exploring history, but this is also really relevant in society today. We know that. And I'm curious how, anti-Semitism is here. It's been here for a long time. Right now, it's even more widely here. But there's, how do you merge this idea of history and like what's contemporary in news and film? Like there's this balance of trying to kind of, in news, we don't put in emotions or music in the way that we do. And, I'm just curious what your experience was in building that, and how you would change or update or modify, if at all, now post making the film to what's going on today.
For a long time, even before this, partially because I come from Russia, and I had made a film called Our New President, which was a film but it was basically the story of Donald Trump told entirely through Russian propaganda. So it's a documentary without a single true statement in it. It's literally all bullshit. And the idea, and seeing that, and it's a combination of sort of Russian propaganda from official state TV, and then people on Russian YouTube reinterpreting it in various colorful, sometimes hilarious ways. But from there, I've really been kind of attuned / obsessed with the way that kind of conspiracy brain is taking over everyone. And once, parallel to that, studying sort of the Jewish history of it, you realize that that's never good for the Jews. And what happens is that in societies, when faith in institutions, faith in kind of history, faith in the ability to figure things out on your own to actually get to the truth, when that gets thrown out, sort of conspiracy theories set in, because it's a way of feeling kind of intellectually superior without doing the legwork. And I'll give you one example. There was a screening of this film recently at Rutgers at Rutgers Jewish Film Festival. And I am up there doing my song and dance, and I mentioned my little thing about all conspiracy theories, chemtrails, flat earthers, et cetera, having the same core idea. After the screening, this nice old lady comes up to me and gives me a handwritten letter on an envelope. I posted it on my Instagram so that people can look at it, explaining to me that I have to watch this film on YouTube called The Dimming, about chemtrails, and all the ways that it's real, and that I should really know what I'm talking about before I say anything. So I go and I watch The Dimming. It's about 2 hours, and there's some questions raised, but it took a lot of work. And then I spent a couple of days kind of reading about The Dimming and who all these people are, to kind of realize what the kernels of truth, what the bullshit is. So we're living in a time, and that more and more this is becoming the MO of how people kind of relate to the world. And that is a very, very scary fact that's not taken nearly as seriously enough as it should. And down to, I remember the John Oliver show had a mashup of news anchors, like people of the sense-making apparatus, talking about how Taylor Swift dating the football player is a conspiracy theory by the NFL, repeating this idea, and it's toxic. It's what gets people to believe that there are these secret networks um, working behind the scenes. The second part of your question, how would I change it? To me, what was interesting was that while I would maybe include certain things about some obscene number of the protocols were sold at the Cairo Book Fair about like 20 years ago. But for the most part, I would keep it the same because weirdly, as massive as anti-Semitism is as a subject and as a phenomenon, the conspiracy brain is almost bigger. And bizarrely, when I was making the film, Robert Bowers, the person who perpetrated the Tree of Life synagogue massacre. Around that time, there were also a bunch of anti-Semitic attacks in Newark, in Long Island, smaller in scale, but nonetheless. And what I found interesting was that none of the perpetrators had any sort of interest, knowledge, concern about the Middle East or anything that was happening there. All of them believed some sort of bizarre version of the replacement theory and sort of that notion of Jews trying to dilute the white voting bloc, all this nonsense. So much so that, so for me, that phenomenon is like anti-Semitism. We're going to be grappling with them in tandem for years to come. And I feel like that the conspiracy brain aspect of it really doesn't get the treatment, the serious treatment that it deserves. I was reading, I think, in The Economist recently, they did something about India, where now like right-wing parties in India are using the George Soros puppet master trope, even though India has had no real history or relationship with the Jews, no kind of history of anti-Semitism that I know of. So it really is this thing where it's very kind of in vogue to now say that, anti-Semitism is both on the right and on the left. Yes, but I feel like that what the film shows is that it's this kind of particular right-wing reaction to European nationalism and a narrative that has gone global now and that has kind of infiltrated all of us. And sort of the most bizarre, I think, like historical irony that comes out of the film, at least for me, is that if you look at both all the tropes that we associate with xenophobia, racism, bigotry, et cetera, almost all of those emerge from the poor Jewish population leaving Russia and arriving in Germany. So the idea of being disease spreaders, sexually promiscuous, stealing jobs, all of those things come. And likewise, almost the entirety of the vocabulary of the social justice movement and the civil rights movement from that really emerges from the Jewish struggle for emancipation and civil rights from in the 19th century and in the 20th. So like a lot of the sort of rhetoric that even people like Trotsky or people that were much more involved in specifically the issue of Jewish emancipation throughout used is those same. So it's amazing how much of the vocabulary and intellectual backbone of everything that we have that we see playing out today comes out of this history.
Absolutely. And I think something I was thinking, where's the part two? Like where's the next step? Like where's that further conversation? I think there's so much more to this. And I'm curious, as we kind of conclude our conversation, why this is the way, and you mentioned a little bit, but like why this is so important for you personally to be a part of, to tell, and where do you think this should go? What else should be told? What else do you think is important as we move forward, knowing that this is a permeating issue in society?
Oh, that's tough. Because for me, what I think about it is the way I think about a film working is like I spent all these hours and years reading about this, kind of immersing myself in this and getting a working hypothesis that I feel like I was very pleased that I think the other day, Bret Stephens had this kind of anti-Semitism guide for the perplexed in the Times, and it was like copying sections out of my movie. Not that I don't think he's seen it. It's just like, so feeling like whenever I read people, more and more people kind of starting to talk about anti-Semitism in using the language of conspiracy theories, I feel happy about it. So what I feel like my job is like, once you process all this and then you create something out of it meaningful, hopefully the experience of watching it, or at least the kinds of movies that I like to make, is that you're not walking away with a certain kind of moralistic perspective, but rather you're able to notice these things, these tropes, and be more cognizant and aware of them when they're happening. So I feel like that, I hope that this film does this for this issue. And yeah, I don't know what else. I would wish for more things like this, and I think that this film has had it's been challenging because first of all, I think that people are often uncomfortable, even Jewish people, sometimes uncomfortable kind of taking on the issue of anti-Semitism, and if it's a big thing, kind of talking about it. I feel like that again, the fact that we are in such an anti-intellectual, anti-history, everything has to be entertaining and kind of light. Yeah.
All bits, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think that this film is a challenge and it has been challenging for, even now there's a lot more kind of demand for it, but the first year, and it was strange because I kind of took it personally at first because but then I had enough screenings with the film. I have enough experience just showing my films that I can tell kind of bullshit enthusiasm from real enthusiasm, and I can see that people really respond to it and feel a lot from watching it. So, so I think that and also the fact that in this film, the vectors of oppressor and oppressed don't line up with our current understanding of it, and that challenge, I think that for a lot of film programmers might feel like it's somehow wrong. And again, you're often dealing with people that don't quite have the historical knowledge, so they're kind of going by intuition and feeling of what lines up with with present day narratives that are accepted. So I feel like that just that kind of deconstructive work and work to undermine that, to reveal complexity, to show, oh, actually it comes out of this, and it was this exactly the same. I think it disrupts it, and to my mind, I find that also recognizing that so much of these social ills do kind of stem from nationalism in one form or another, in different forms, and recognizing that mostly as I'm sort of an old school lefty in that, where I kind of find that all nationalism is a bit suspect and difficult to deal with, and usually creates, especially in the kind of world that we live in now. I mean, I'm banned from Russia for, or I would be arrested the second that I got there for all these kinds of things. So it's anyway, I'll fizzle out without having a dramatic ending.
No, I think it's great. And I think what the film does, my mind is racing. I want to have a conversation offline about, guiding questions for learners. How could this really, especially for the younger generation, you pinpointed it, the need for these kind of bite-sized pieces of historical understanding, and the need for understanding where this is coming from and to question. I think that that's what this is doing as we deconstruct the various pieces. It makes you question your assumptions, and that's so important.
Yeah, I think that for kids, listen, I mean, if we think that kids aren't going to be like again, the extent to which we've normalized kind of conspiracy brain and conspiracy theories. What, you don't think that those young kids that are, let's say, growing up in vaguely anti-Semitic households, they're not gonna, that's not gonna come in and you know, and play out in that way. So I think that that's a realization, is that again, we have an education crisis. That education crisis, that the vacuum left by that is filled in by this kind of thinking. And again, that's, history shows us that that's never had any good consequences for Jewish people.
Correct. Well, hopefully this film, as we share it with our festival viewers and with and you continue to share it worldwide, that piece of education will continue to expand. I want to thank you, Maxim, so much for joining us. Are there any final words you want to share with our viewers today?
Well, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. Tell people about the film and get the word out. We're doing lots of outreach for it. So yeah, you can write to our production company and organize a screening or whatever.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, and all of you film lovers for participating in the Miami Jewish Film Festival this year. Take care.